Welcome to everyone today for our next in our series of webinars. Today, I'm very excited that we've got Dr. Anthony joining us, and before we get to him, there's a couple of things that I just want to run through with you about, and just to give you a little introduction to us as an organization, and also a sense of what these webinars are about and why we keep doing this. First of all, it's great that you're joining us, and thank you for doing that. And we hope that you'll be participating in what is today an interactive webinar. Your participation is critical to this because, like anything that is as diverse and complex as leadership, there is no single answer, and your engagement and your thoughts are always welcome and appreciated. So first of all, yes, welcome to the webinar. Tonight's event, as you know, is working with leaders in Overdrive. We consistently are bringing you webinars and expert leaders and their information, their knowledge, their thoughts in the field of coaching and leadership development. And we continue to do that. And tonight is no exception. If you are not on our mailing list, then please do reach out and either send us an email to office@wwacoaching.com or go on our website and register there. And also, because this is one in a series, we have another webinar that's coming up in next month in May, on the 4th of May. And that will be gremlin taming and self-mastery. And Rick Carson will be joining us all the way from Texas. And we're excited by that, to have him on the line next month. And there's much more details on our website currently, and you can start registering for that now. And if not, then just wait for the invites that will be coming out shortly. So who are we? Who is WWA Corporate Coaching? There's a number of things that I believe are, I guess, set us aside or set us apart. And one is that we've been established now since 2004. And also we're the largest coaching company in the region. We've got over 35 professional certified coaches. And we're aligned with the International Coach Federation as part of that professional certification. That's a very important part for us, because that really is about setting the right standards and ethical practices for coaching in this particular region, for the Middle East and North Africa, which is the region that we operate in. And if you want, we're specialists in what is a generalist market on the whole. We're not a training company that does a bit of coaching on the side. We are focused on coaching, and that's very much what we do. And in that vein, these are the areas that we specialize in: executive and leadership performance coaching, which is a lot of the one-to-one senior level stuff that we do. We work with leadership teams around the region, and again, working with formal coaching models to deliver coaching in those environments. And then we are working with organizations on their own coaching journeys and all of the different elements that brings to that, as well as change management within those organizations. Part of those coaching journeys can sometimes be about developing coaching skills across the organization, and that's something that we do both in English and in Arabic. And something that we've really started to lean into a lot more now is working with mentoring programs. And we've got some very interesting conversations going on about mentoring in the region. As you know, it's another support structure to organizational development, and a very important one that we feel, but does require, again, a specialist approach and tools. So that's something else that we are focused on delivering. Tonight we're going to work in three different sections, and each section and Dr. Anthony has said that this was probably the best format, and I agree with him in the sense that we will start with understanding the leadership concept, the leadership shadow concept, and I think that's important that the concept first is grounded and understood. And so we'll have a Q&A at the end of that section, as we will do after the idea that what are the problems, the challenges, and the issues that the shadow creates. And then we'll do a Q&A there, and also then at the end. If you want to ask a question, and we actively encourage you to do so, stick up your hand. My colleague with me at the moment, Kiki, will help us manage that. And as you say, you've got an option to put your hand in the air there. And please, if not, send a chat email directly to her, and we'll try and engage you in that journey. Well, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Anthony very quickly. I've come across Anthony really through quite a considerable amount of UK press. He's very much at the forefront of quite I would say, a relatively new area, and certainly, Anthony, you can qualify that for us as we go into this. But he works as a director for Calibra Consulting and does a lot of consulting work around Europe, US, Africa, Russia, and Asia. So all around. Along with that, of course, you're co-author, and I'm not going to steal the thunder, of a very interesting book, and I think we might get into that shortly. And so I want to give the floor to you, Anthony, and thank you very much for your involvement today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. I take it that you can now see my screen. If not, it will be coming up to you.
I'm just going to present you now, hopefully.
There we go. Okay. Right. So if we get going, thank you, Nick, for that. I think we've got started together, and thanks for the introduction. I'm aware of the time we've got, and there's quite a lot to squeeze in. So I'll get straight into the presentation itself and the discussions following the format that Nick has introduced. I think, first of all, before going any further, we all are aware and work with leaders. Some of us on this webinar will be leaders ourselves, or will be working with leaders in various fashions. And we will have realized that actually good leadership, as Nick was saying, comes in all shapes and sizes, and it was of interest to us when we started doing this work. But the first key thing was we noticed that very often what it takes for leaders the very best top leaders to get to the top of their organizations, large or small, may be one thing, and what it takes to sustain them over a period of time through different contexts is another. And it was in the process of actually working with leaders from across the world that we were curious about this aspect of some things which go really well, and also some things which are perhaps less hidden and in certain contexts become a challenge or problematic. And very often our experience of leaders is that there are things about them which are really good and strong and effective, and there will be other things that really could drive us mad about them. And the problem is you can't split a person in two. You get the whole package. And also in particular circumstances, we're all aware of how really effective, otherwise capable people can seem to just simply go awry. For those of you who are familiar with Myers-Briggs, for example, you have heard of the term in the grip, and there are various ways of talking about it. So in the webinar today, we wanted to talk about this phenomenon of the leadership shadow, and I'll talk about a little more about it and what it is. We'd like to explore some of the issues that relate to that, and perhaps as we get to the end, look at some practical suggestions that it may be available to us as leaders and working with or following leaders to address some of these issues. Nick has already talked about the three parts of the seminar or of the webinar, but I'd like to emphasize as well one particular aspect is that there's an enormous amount here And I've been selective about what I picked out. So when you have your questions and so on, it will guide us a little bit about what to focus on. But one of the key things is to have a few key takeaways that you can have that might be useful for you in the reflections that you have. So, what is the leadership shadow? As we all know, there is no such thing as a perfect leader. And when you think of a leader now, as a coach or as a leader yourself, some of the questions are around that are often around is what is a good leader? And you'll immediately have some views about what makes them successful, why you consider them to be successful. And that may then lead you to thinking about what is leadership about? Yeah. And so you'll see them, for example, convening lots of people, encouraging, inspiring, possibly setting visions, being very effective in the work they're doing, working hard and working effectively, thinking strategically, as well as being able to dive deep down and do things in detail, both empowering and delegating, as well as being quite directive when necessary. There's a whole range of aspects. And actually, when you then look at that and you say, what is leadership about? It's quite a challenge. And we'll go back to that question about what leadership is about. But what we do know is leaders come in all shapes and sizes, and the leader that might be very effective in one context can actually find themselves very challenged in another. So if you were to think about a leader and think about when she's at her best, what specific qualities and values and what specific qualities others would value and think, oh, those stand out about her. And why do these qualities matter? Typically, what people will say is things like, she's engaging, she listens well, she gets to the point, she's inclusive, she's appropriately directive, she gives good feedback. There'll be all those things that people actually describe. But we all know that actually somebody who gives good feedback and is clear and specific, pushed too far, if that quality is pushed too far, could come across as being pedantic, nitpicking, and unhelpful, and just overcritical. Similarly, somebody who is inclusive and consultative, pushed too far, could come across as being undecisive, keeps asking questions, doesn't really get things done in time, and so on. So there are some aspects which we may say are very much on the sunny side, things that people immediately see and recognize as value. But at the same time, you can't have that aspect without having a little bit of a shadow behind it. And how big that shadow may be, of course, could be lesser or more. So when we were looking at the concept of a leadership shadow, we were looking at some of those core qualities that actually make a leader effective in their context. But we were not only stopping there, we were also interested in some of the things that go alongside those core qualities, but are perhaps more hidden, and in certain circumstances come out and take control and possibly can be problematic. Now, so the term leadership shadow is a metaphorical description, really, of this split between what is seen and shined the light on and what is pushed away and into obscurity. For many leaders, they're appointed and they're selected for their qualities. Very rarely are people selected for the things that they won't do wrong. Yeah. So we don't often put too much attention on some of their weaknesses. And indeed, having done very many assessment centers myself, very often, as soon as you see a candidate you want, many of the potential challenges are completely glossed over or ignored in the rush to get the right person on quickly. But we all know there's no perfect leader, just like there's no perfect human being. So when you do take somebody on board, you take these elements together. Now, the idea of the leadership shadow isn't new in the sense that those who studied Jungian psychology will have come across the concept of a shadow. And indeed, in most cultures across the world, in myths and stories and fables, the idea of the shadow is very, very strong. So if you read children's stories, there'll be questions about ideas about shadow. And in many spaces and places, this idea is very strong. In the book, we go through it and we describe quite a lot about the leadership shadow. and how it's experienced in various places. As far back as in ancient Egypt and Greece, the idea of a shadow appears in fairy tales from there. If you look at opera across the world, the idea of the shadow is very strong. You will come across the shadow, of course, in things like children's fairy tales in Hans Christian Andersen and so on. And more latterly in films and so on, the idea of the hero who has a shadow is very clear in everything from Superman, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Jekyll and Hyde, you name it. And we experience that very much in daily life. If you look at leadership in all areas, both in politics, in business, and even in charitable work, the leader who is really, really strong, but also terrifies or in certain circumstances is quite difficult and complex, is not an unexpected thing. So what is it that creates this, and what aspect is it? Of course, as I mentioned, one of it is the qualities and also the personality patterns that people have. But it is particularly significant because you notice the shadow, because when you decide to take a leadership intervention, as we call it, so if anybody suddenly says, I'm going to lead this, or I'm given a leadership role, by definition, they separate a little bit from the group. You cannot lead without some separation. So the moment I say we're going to take the company in this direction rather than the one that we're in, there's a separation of ideas and a separation of significance and symbolism. Similarly, if a footballer leads a team in a particular direction, there's a bit of a separation before others follow. And in this separation, there's a moment of actually saying, shining the light on the qualities of the leader, on what their ideas are, on the way of doing things, and so on. And no wonder, very often, I used to be surprised, why is it that one leader can change an organization of 1,000 or 10,000 people, when in fact, you ask yourself, why did that happen? Because, it's unbelievable that one person can make so much of the difference. But as I've worked with people, it is because as they separate, and they set up a new way of being, a new way of working, and so on, what happens is with good leadership, it ends up with integration. People join that, and it cascades, and that's why it has such an effect. So what the leader shines the light on matters, but also this essence will also create a split. There's a rift that takes place between leaders and followers. And as it allows new possibilities, it also creates a tension which can reveal some of the dangers behind it. So a new leader who says we'll do more of this, will be more directive, will sell harder, will be more competitive, also by definition is splitting away some element, which is saying, if you're not with this, or the different way of working may not be the one that we really support. Now that split is okay, as long as that is not expressed psychologically within the team and with the personalities. Okay, so let's go a bit further along and talk very quickly about why it matters. It matters because the nature of leadership is that you cannot really define it a priori. Good leadership can only be defined in the context of what is going on in the place and in the challenges. So somebody who's really good at leading in one place may be actually quite ineffective in another. And so by its very nature, leadership can be experienced in very many different ways. It can be autocratic in direction, it can be motivational, it can be inspirational, it can be encouraging, it can be all of those things you see there. Okay, and so what really happens is that it is co-created and constructed between people. So as I impose and bring what I bring as a leader, that takes meaning within a setting, within an organization, and we construct that together. It is entirely relational. As one leader once said to me, lock me up and take away my mobile phone and see how much power I've got. So it is about what goes on between people, and it's created as people connect, talk to each other, integrate, and it's power related. It's actually also recognizing that you're passing the power to do something and to make something and to make meaning to somebody else, to which you then connect with. It's often very distributed, context specific and contingent on what's going on around it. And ultimately, it can only be assessed at how well the effect of that team work is. So for example, in the end, and this is a bit of a controversial statement, but in our view, it is increasingly true. The only way you can really actually say was that leader effective is as a result of their work and their interrelationships and interactions. They've lifted the team or the organization in the league of performance. Because otherwise, there's actually no real measure of good leadership. You couldn't say that being more directive is better than being more engaging or whatever. Ultimately, it is performance. So it matters because leaders enable and support and legitimize what an organization can do in a context. It is experienced through their behaviors, and it can settle in very important influential patterns. And in the book, we talk a lot about patterns in terms of roles, boundaries, valencies, and processes. We don't have the time to go into that, but those are all psychological considerations that take place as a leader works with their particular pattern of working. But most importantly, it is because a leader's role is about supporting, inspiring, and containing. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. So I'd like to take a break there for some questions and invite Nick perhaps to help us again here. Just to take some questions, but also to take a poll. Do you identify with the idea that leaders have a shadow and that it can be both positive as well as negative? So do you identify that leaders that you know of or you've experienced can have a shadow and it can be both positive or negative?
Great. So let's out to the audience. If you will put your hand up and I will unmute you, and then you'll have a chance just to ask that question and give us your opinion. So please, somebody put your hand up for me. I can't believe that there's a shy bunch out there. I'm looking at the names. There's not many shy ones that I can see on there, at least the ones I know. Well, here we go. Sorry. Manal, I'm going to unmute you. And Manal, you're live on the webinar. So yes, your thoughts and questions, please.
That's right. Is the shadow you're referring to is actually the weaknesses or of the leaders?
Yeah. The answer is that they can be weaknesses, but they can also be strengths. I like often thinking about it as either overcooked strengths or things that go alongside a particular strength. To give you a very simple, straightforward example, one of the things that I'm doing right now, for example, is speaking very, very quickly. And the value of that is that we'll get through a lot. The other side of that is that actually some people may miss some of my words.
Yes.
So in certain situations, it will be a weakness. In other situations, it will be a strength. But you've got it together. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's an overdrive when it's a strength in overdrive.
It can be a strength in an overdrive, and often it's the context that might decide it. And when we go on to the next session, I'll particularly point out when it becomes problematic. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Manal. That's excellent.
Thank you.
One more question here from Sarah, but I don't think I can unmute you for some reason. If you can send us your question, Sarah, for some reason. Here we go. Hang on. I'm going to send you what they call an audio pin. I have no idea what that is, but hopefully that will help us. In the meantime, any other questions and thoughts just at this point in the webinar? Great. I'm going to come back to I'm going to come back to you, Sarah. I think. Here we go. Hang on, Sarah. You're there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Wonderful. So yes, your question, please. Thank you.
I think it's really interesting that we're talking about the shadow aspect. I think one of the things that I've noticed in Region, and specifically in a diverse organization, is the gap between the individual's intention and the perception. So I see a lot of the shadow happening, that gap between what an individual shows up as and what others perceive it in.
Yeah. I think that's a very good comment, actually, a very insightful comment, because by definition, some people are aware of their shadows and some people are not. And more often than not, when you work with leaders, they often say, well, what do you mean? I didn't say that, and so on. And they're not aware of the impact that they have and the shadow they have. And one of the premises that we'll get to at the end is actually the whole question of self-awareness of leaders. How do you help people develop awareness of themselves, of their shadows, and also how those shadows turn up in different contexts, because they may not be as important or noticeable in some contexts as another. It's a lovely metaphor because, as you can imagine, if you go into the sunshine, the shadow appears. If you go into the shade, it may not be seen. So in some places, people do not know. And often people will say to me, that's not the leader that I know. But they've never seen them in particular contexts. They've never seen them really under pressure, or they've never seen them having to give critical feedback, or never seen them having to actually give positive feedback or whatever. So often these shadow elements turn up in certain contexts and not in others.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I muted you there. There was a lot of background noise. One more question very quickly before we move forward. Cameron, I'm just unmuting you now. So yeah, I'd love to hear your question, Cameron.
Thank you. Very quickly. So is it correct to assume that shadows appear in relationships? That's where we spot them?
I believe that it is, because it's through the interaction that you become and behaviors that you become aware of it. As we go on, of course, you'll see, because in a sense, that's the only way as individuals we become aware of what a person is like. You know, so they only become aware of that. Now, having said that, one thing that is true is that people develop reputations, and by developing reputations, you then also have followers responding to leaders as if they knew them, and with some assumptions. So often the shadow effect can extend beyond the person's relationship. So you may never have met a CEO in a department or in a branch, but when they turn up, everybody will behave in a certain way because that's the reputation they have. So they are maybe reacting to some of the shadow aspects of that reputation. And indeed, in the book, we talk about the fact that you have often very strong parallel processes that take place in organizations. So if a leader is very directive and autocratic, it is likely that that parallel process will play out again in that organization in other places. As coaches and psychologists, we often will experience a group which has nothing to do with a leader interacting, and we find that actually the same process is replicated in other places because of the of parallel process effects. So yes, it turns up in relationship. Yes, you can see it behaviorally, particularly when in situations that send people in overdrive, and it can also have these ripple effects that turn up in different parts of the organization and in a sense influence the culture of the organization.
Thank you, Cameron. That's excellent. So, Anthony, perhaps we can move on to the next part, and then we'll field some more questions at the next stop.
Okay. Now, as we've already said, context matters, and I'd like to say a little thing about context and about some of the work and the theories that we then developed around that, and then particularly introduce before going on to looking at the particular patterns of leadership. So, as always, good leaders and effective leaders often have very good and effective followers. And in the book, we have stories that we tell along the way to illustrate. I won't read this long story, this fable here, but it's essentially the story of a frog who wanted a king. And Zeus, ancient Greek god, gave them a piece of wood to look after, to be their king, and they didn't like it very much because it didn't do very much. So they went back and asked for a new leader. Instead, he gave them a water serpent who ended up actually coming and eating all the frogs up. And this is an ancient fable, Aesop's fable, but essentially we use it to illustrate that what you have with one leader and the shadow of one leader, you could exchange for something else, but you never get the perfect thing. So the context matters. And let's look first of all at our 21st century context. First of all, I mean, all of these things are not new to you. We're working in a globalized world. I'm sitting in the UK. Next month, you're having a webinar from somebody in the US. Some of you are in the Middle East. Some of you may be even further afield. And we are connected and we're having a conversation. And many of you will be doing this work. Many of you are traveling and so on. It's a continuous, almost 24/7 now, globalized working culture. It's multicultural, it's cross-boundary. You're expected to be able often to work in different languages, in different cultures, and sometimes to switch from one to the other really quickly. Massive information overload happening all the time in multiple media, very dynamic, always on and expected to be on. Change is fast, it's endemic, it's complex, and the demands are really challenging. And when you think how slowly the human physical form and brain has evolved over many millions of years, the idea that we could adapt to the technological changes so quickly and be able to deal with them so effectively is laughable. There's so much going on an ongoing basis. And I mean, in one sense, it's remarkable how human beings manage to survive and to thrive. On the other hand, it's not surprising how stressful and challenging the environment in which people live today is. Now, when you go on from there and you look at the leader themselves, not only are they working in this really fast, endemic, and complex environments, they're tested, and their abilities to adapt and change are really tested tremendously. They work under great scrutiny and transparency. Once upon a time, as you know, it took ages to do things. Nowadays, sometimes when I'm working or coaching or teaching, as I'm doing that, people are Googling me and sending messages to each other about what they think about what I'm saying. It's all very, very active. Now, imagine that as a leader. The days are gone when you could send an edict and expect everybody to follow it. And very often, there's organization and activity going on at the edges that you're not aware of, but you're expected to be responsible for. There's more cultural diversity, more people working together, but not always necessarily working effectively together. And there's a permeability of influences that takes place all the time, and a contestation of which culture and which way of working should take precedence in a global organization or a company that's trading globally, even if it's a local company. So if we were to do a webinar or a call and we are a global company, what should we do it on? GMT, East African Standard Time, Eastern US time, or the time in Hong Kong? And who decides? And all those kinds of elements. So at our best, we work very well with this. We are self-aware, we can be flexible, we have a strong sense of strategy, but we can also get into the weeds and look at the reality. We work hard, we can work in teams, or we can work as individuals, as solo artists. We can be motivators as well as assessors. We can convene as well as separate. And we can be prepared to follow as well as lead. We can do all of these things. And quite frankly, to get a leader who can do all of these things, cope with all of these, would be simply superhuman, who was good at everything and had no things that they couldn't do, they didn't do badly. So I'm impressed by many of the leaders I meet, because many of them do really well, and no doubt you will have had the same experience. But the context that the leaders are in is really challenging, and it's not surprising that they have to drive really hard to get this effect. I've met people who've had to be really driven to get to the top. They had to push hard, to be very bullheaded, sometimes not to listen to others because others would distract them, to turn a company around and to get to the top. And then when they get there, they realize that this behavior is not going to keep them sustained. Then nobody will talk to them, nobody will share information with them. They now have to relate. They now have to be relational, quite different from the hard driving perspective. And sometimes it's vice versa. You get to the top by being collusive and inclusive. And then when you get to the top, the context changes and you have to be really dramatically decisive. So it is challenging. And typically, the challenge occurs in three situations: when an executive is promoted into a new role, when a new role that an executive is comfortable in and used to unexpectedly changes, and when an executive finds him or herself in a role that has not existed before. We found that those are the three key instances often when people go in overdrive. Because typically, when promoted into a new role that has challenges the person has not seen before, they try harder, they work hard, they push hard, and could possibly go into overdrive. We don't really have the time to go through each and every single one in detail, but I'm sure those situations will resonate with you. And you, if you've gone from one role to another, or have seen other people moving from one role to another, or being given new roles, you'll see how the potential for derailment and going into overdrive heightens, particularly if a person is already got some of those danger areas of going into overdrive. So, if you reflect on the way you as a leader or leaders you support work, you'll find that what is discouraging and frustrating and tiring is one thing. There are other things what are positive, enabling, and energizing. And leaders will often have these two aspects. And understanding that and being aware of that is really important. Being able to understand what they are really very good at and what things are problematic and they tend to push in the back, and making sure that they are able to, as it were, get the support for those kinds of things. In the work that we've done, we've understood that the key aspect about the way leaders work is that they work by supporting others, and we call that domain of leadership the supportive domain. And that is when leaders are facilitating or enabling a team's effectiveness and enhancing the resources and competencies that are available. And this particular domain of leadership is what we call the doing function. Then there is an inspiring aspect of leadership, which is about supplying the team with a strategy and meaning making. And that is a thinking function. And we've got what we call a containing function, which is looking after or caring for the team, nurturing and providing space and providing boundaries for processing emotions and for understanding to emerge. And we call it a feeling function. So leaders will be active in all those domains. They'll be doing things to facilitate and enable productive development and use of resources and competencies. They'll be doing things, so that's the doing function, leadership as doing. They'll be inspiring people to think creatively, to go beyond boundaries, to be problem solving, to make new strategies, to make new meaning. And that's a thinking function. And there's also a feeling function, which is about containing the anxieties, making space for disagreement, creating understanding, and bringing people together, a containing function. Now, inevitably, as they do these, there is a shadow side to each of these. And we found that some leaders will have a strong emphasis on doing, and others will have a strong emphasis on thinking, and others may have a very strong emphasis on feeling. And each of these areas possibly has potential shadow sides. So if you're strong on the supportive domain and you're very much on the doing function, you can create an illusion of omnipotence. So you feel everything that you say goes and everything that you do works well. And that shadow effect in the rest of our organization can be how brilliant you are and how everything you touch turns to gold and so on. And it can create a sense of omnipotence, which means that people might not be as forthcoming with ideas. They may wait for you to decide, and so on and so forth. Similarly, inspiration, which is and the thinking function around creating new ideas, new strategies, and so on, can create the illusion of infallibility. So whatever comes up, you can think through it and come across another solution or idea that beats the one that somebody else has. And as a result, people stop bringing new ideas, they stop being creative, or they feel that it may not be valued or in certain contexts. And finally, the whole domain of containment and the feeling function is, as people work very hard around this area and come across as being very inclusive, nurturing, opening space and boundaries for people to process emotions, they can create an illusion of being invulnerable. Invulnerable in the sense that there is nothing that actually challenges me. I'm always on top of it. I'm always in control of everything, and I help others to deal with their emotions. But for me, nothing can really, as it were, knock me off my perch. So those are some of the leadership shadow aspects. And we, in our work, are particularly aware that it is important to be aware of our own drivers that might drive us in certain domains, and how those drivers can affect and influence the way we work with others. Hence, it's important to understand what our qualities are and what enables us, and what we do to get our best results. And in the gray box at the bottom, what happens when these drivers and qualities overshoot. Now, you'll be familiar with drivers, some of you, and the work we draw from the work of Tayyip Kala, which looks at 5 behavioral drivers: be perfect, please others, hurry up, be strong, and try hard. And we match those up against some of the personality patterns, and we also look at some of the core qualities in the work that's developed by Daniel Hoffman. I'm not able to go in this short time through all those various details, but through that work and the study that we were looking at, we were able to both grow also on our experience in coaching and use stories as well that we've got from our experience to actually look at some of the personality adaptations that are prevalent, which represent these 3 domains: the doing function, the thinking function, and the containing and feeling function, and also relate them to some of these drivers and come up with, as it were, a broad classification that shows how people might be driven into overdrive. And in particular, we are aware that being driven and working hard and being committed is in itself not an issue. So if you're pushing hard in the doing function and driving things, you can have a lot of impact. If you are thinking creatively and coming up with new strategies, you can have a lot of impact. If you're helping people to deal with change and concerned with change, you can have a lot of impact. The problem is when you go beyond the impact zone and you get into the hubris zone. And hubris is a Greek term which actually means overstepping the mark. And people overstep the mark in different ways. You can overstep the mark by being non-ethical. You can overstep the mark by overstretching yourself or other people or resources, or becoming more authoritarian. There are many ways you can overstep the mark. And hubris as a term relates particularly to offending against a rule structure that is fundamental or overstepping the mark. We looked at patterns of leaders and how those different patterns overstep the mark. So we came up with those ways of describing it. And in a sense, for those who are psychologists, if you do more work and look at some of the work in the book, you'll see that this also relates to some of the work that has been done by others as well. So it is bringing together ideas and research that has been done by others and building it together and making it accessible. So whilst we've given these particular names to these patterns, others will call them other names, which are born out of research and literature that has gone before us. So we called the doing function the movers and shakers, and we have those classifications: the detached diplomat, the glowing greatness, the playful encourager, and the charming manipulator. Then we've got the rigorous thinkers and the sensitive carers, so the thinking function and the feeling functions. And of course, we are aware that people are not so simple that they may fall in just one aspect rather than the other. There may be a combination of these patterns that people experience. So a charming manipulator may have aspects of being a responsible workaholic and so on. So these are really ways of actually describing patterns of behavior and adapted patterns, rather than trying to pigeonhole people simply into one box or another. Indeed, to some extent, it can be unhelpful to pigeonhole people. The way we use it in the book is to help people actually become more aware of their challenges, more aware of some of their possible danger areas or overdrives, and we use stories, we use illustrations, and through that, then say, how can you get better at it? How can you work more effectively with it? How can you make some of these shadow elements much stronger? What do you put around yourself to help you with that? So the aim is not to be negative and push everybody down in a downward spiral, but actually to be positive, to see the shadow areas as being part of the whole and something which, if worked with well and with others, with self-awareness, can be actually quite beneficial. Okay, so I would like to pause again, and then we can look at some implications and some takeaways, but I'll pause again for some questions or comments.
Good. So we'll open the floor up again. If you could put your hand up, or if you don't know where that is, to send us a quick question. That might be another way to do that. All right, who have we got? Okay, so I'm going to reach out to Carol. So I'm just going to unmute you, Carol, and love to hear your question, your thoughts.
Hi, really interesting webinar this afternoon. So thank you very much for this really powerful overview of leadership in the shadow. But I wanted to ask a question around, to what extent does diversity impact on the perception of the shadow in organizations?
Yeah, to what the question is, to what extent does diversity impact on the perception of the shadow in an organization?
That's right. I think I really appreciate the context is absolutely critical and important, and depending on whether you're male, female, black, white, gay, straight, Christian, Muslim, that will have, you know, in my view, have an opinion, have an impact. So I just wanted to know what your opinion is.
Yeah. I think absolutely does, in the sense that in our experience, there will be folklore as well as assumptions about what a good leader is. For example, I started my management career working with a UK, European, Anglo-Dutch multinational. When we bought and took over Japanese business, and we had some Japanese managers working with us in Europe, they looked at our adverts for leaders and said, what? That's not a good leader, because we were asking for people who are go-getting and single-minded and creative and so on. And their assumption about what good leadership is that you're inclusive, you're not go-getting in that kind of selfish way and so on. And so, no doubt, as people with different perceptions about what leadership is, different upbringings, different cultural perceptions, will have very different views about what the leader's strength is and what may be indeed in the shadow. And so that is one of the challenges, particularly as you move from one context into another. And it's also the challenge of creating a diverse enough organization that's able to work with and deal with all the complexities that we face. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is you can be an organization that's not at all diverse, but working with very, very diverse customers. We've seen that. And we've seen organizations that are terribly diverse already as well. There's a whole mix of things. But inevitably, part of the leadership role is to actually create a new sense of what leadership means to us in our community and with the people we work with and the people who work with us. Leaders' responsibility, in my view, is to educate and integrate. So if you have a diverse organization, as a leader, it's your responsibility to educate all the different people and, as it were, elements about each other, and to help to integrate it for the purpose of joint working to the shared goal. Without that, what you end up having fragmentation and scapegoating, which obviously is not helpful.
Great, thank you, Carol. One more question, then we'll go to the last part. I'm also aware of time, so I want to try and do what I can to keep within that. Manal, you have another question, so please.
Okay. How different or similar this model to the Hogan model?
Okay. Thank you very much for describing that. So, I said that if you look underneath it, you come across other things. We did go very, very much on the Hogan model in looking at and so you can, the patterns that we've got there and the adaptive patterns match very, very closely to the Hogan model. And in fact, in the process of doing the work, we both shared our work with Hogan, and we also went through our own work relating to that. So if you're very familiar with the Hogan model, if you look at this, you'll be very familiar with it.
Great, thank you, Manal. Anthony, would you like to move on to the last part? Because I know that's probably one of the most critical in terms of what are some of the solutions and outcomes from this?
Yeah, and actually, just to pick up from Manal's question, one of the challenges of the Hogan model, which is tremendous as a resource, we believe, is how difficult people sometimes find to use it, or how often people ignore it or find it difficult to use as part of a process, a developmental process, or and we think there are some missed opportunities there, but that is another story. Okay, now. Coming on to what are the implications for leaders, HR professionals, and coaches? Well, I think the first thing is being aware always of the context. Always aware of the context, and it's in a way it's such an obvious thing that it's easy to actually ignore it or overlook it. But it's so surprising how often leaders themselves do not actually stop to reflect on context and how they are turning up. And actually that even within one organization, there could be very many contexts. And in one day, they're shifting from one context to another. So that was one piece. Another aspect is just a tremendous development and requirement for continuing development of self-awareness. You can never get too much feedback. It's a question of how you receive it and what you do with it. And for leaders in today's complex organizations with all the multifaceted aspects of it, it's absolutely critical, particularly knowing that there are patterns of collusion around a leader that naturally happen. I've been in situations where I've been working as director generals of organizations and so on, and become aware how the moment I got the role, I suddenly find that things start happening without me even saying anything. People make assumptions and patterns organize themselves around me. So really important to actually be aware of that and to get feedback and actually be more choiceful in it. And the third area is recognizing that every challenge that turns up for you as a leader is not necessarily your challenge. It could be somebody else's. It may come through you. It may be, you may be involved in it, but you don't have to deal with it. I say those three things because the next thing is really the key implication for a leader is they have to work a way of engaging with their leadership shadow. And it's through these three things: context, self-awareness, and dealing with challenges. And to cut a long story short, leaders have to learn to step away and decide where they step up and where they step down. And many leaders today do not actually do enough stepping away. The context demands that they're always on and they're running at 110 miles an hour and so on. And very often, actually, what they need to sustain them suffers, and what they need to keep that clarity suffers. So one encouragement is to literally to make sure that leaders do actually step away, and to be more reflective and to realize where they have to step up, step down, or do differently, which means they have to stay engaged and relational. Very often when things go wrong, one of the first things that you notice is a breakdown of engagement and relationship. Whenever as I coach, I go into an organization where there is serial breakdown of relationship, I immediately want to go and see the leader and see what the leader's relationships are like, and vice versa. So being relational is often a way of actually protecting against going into overdrive. Responding also by developing more capacities, more strength, and more toughness. You have to do this. They have to become more versatile, more resilient. And in the book, we talk about developing resilience. But that is not sufficient. It's also about developing the ability to work with change and be less driven and to be less maladapted. So for those, as you mentioned before, Hogan, if you know your danger areas, actually have strategies to protect against that and to work against that. Really very important. So it's not just about shining the light and developing more and more strengths in a narrow area. It's about breadth and also particularly about working with change and understanding yourself. As the ancient Greeks said, human being, know thyself. There's another aspect which is about acquiring better integration and more balance. And there's a big debate that goes on about whether you can really balance things or not. My sense is that leaders have to be very good at knowing what sphere they're in and moving from one to another and integrating them. It's almost impossible to get complete balance in one or another. So for example, if you're doing a big deal and that has to be done within a certain time, things go out of balance because all your dedication is in that. But actually being aware of that and reintegrating and taking time to bring things back together is really important. And so I would really encourage all those aspects of work that relate to thinking contextually, thinking about one context rising while another one falls, and so on, and choosing the context within which you play and which ones you delegate. Leaders also need to have a place to reflect, and depending on their personality, this can be a very personal place. They're social beings, and often I think in the technology-driven world where they're on 24/7 and traveling globally, this can suffer. But that is not just true of leaders, it's true of all of us as people. And then they have to find places where, ways and means, where they can actually reconnect with their personal vision. Most people who end up leading large organizations or taking top leadership situation, they don't do it just for the money, although often the money doesn't matter. They do it because they believe one thing or another, or something is meaningful, or they are doing something for a purpose. And very often, as I talk to leaders when they are in overdrive or when they're feeling under tremendous stress, that purpose gets lost. And reconnecting with it and saying, how is that meaningful within that context, is often an important aspect of re-energizing. I'm aware of the time, so I will very quickly talk about some of the elements about dealing with the light and working with the shadow. The key questions to ask when you're working with the light, the strengths, is thinking about what are your unique strengths? Where do these qualities best work and manifest themselves? How do are these qualities potentially go in overdrive when you're challenged? What triggers these overdrives and so on? But also working with a shadow. What are the strongest behavioral drivers? What drivers play out? How may these hinder others and so on? So actually spending some time with that, and sometimes if help with a trusted confidant or a coach is a really important thing. We know that good leaders are good learners and they're good long-term learners. And we also know that actually, when you look at most organizations, the only sustainable source of competitive advantage is the ability to learn faster than your environment demands and your competitors are doing. So within the context of learning, I think addressing what is in the shadow is clearly important. And then finally, every now and then, of course, with all of that, you can get lost. Things go wrong, and there's a need for recovery. And this I address particularly at those who are helping to appoint leaders or to coach leaders. It's really important to pay attention to well-being and to protect well-being of individuals, of teams, and of organizations. So the first question to ask is, what do we need to look after that, whatever that is? And then after that, dealing with what is helping and what isn't, what are the best ways to connect with others and to recover, and what should I give or should we give our attention to next? I think in a very structured way, one can recover from episodes of hubris and actually can be much, much stronger as a result of it. It doesn't need to be a disaster as long as it's engaged with and done with openness and support. I think that is all I would like to do for now.
Fantastic.
There are just a couple of other slides which are just talking about what is good leadership, and I think we've covered that. And also really a last thing saying, if you think about a leader, you can actually bring together some thoughts about how to help them if they go into overdrive.
Great, Anthony. Thank you. I'm gonna, before we just close off, I'm gonna open the floor up. I believe, Sam, you have a question. I'm gonna unmute you and let's hear your question. And also, if anybody else got any final questions, we'd love to hear them. And I think that last section is a really interesting one to lean into a little bit. Sam, have I got you? I think not. Okay, so any other questions as we draw to a close? I think there are still some interesting ideas and thoughts that certainly could be explored.
Nick?
Yes, I have a question from Sam. She's unable to get through. I'm just going to unmute Kiki. Kiki's going to just give us that question. Kiki. Okay, Sam is there. Great, Sam, you've got the floor.
Thank you. And my question was back when you spoke about the similarities with Hogan. I could hear Johari window about known to self, blind to self, known to others, blind to others. Is this similar to the shadow? Because, you know, the shadow, when I look at it, and I'm not yet abreast of it, it tends to think we know what our shadow drivers and behaviors are, whereas Johari window perhaps is there is blind self and blind to others.
Yeah.
Is there a similarity?
Absolutely, there is, and there's a sense in which we never really completely discover everything that's in our shadow. Yeah, so there's an element in which that there are some things which you're aware of, some things you're not, and actually some things which never become aware of because the context of the situation never brings them to the fore. So there's some things which are completely hidden. And that's why I encourage leaders, particularly if they're ones that work in very many environments, to always continue be going out, to be curious, to experiment, to spend time with people in other contexts and so on, to keep on doing that, because as they do that, they discover both their strengths as well as some of the things they have to become more aware of. So there is a Johari element of it. And there is definitely also an element which is about a whole sense of a philosophy of life, because when you think about it, most of our learning as adults really takes place when we are most challenging, when we are faced with new circumstances or we are faced with new questions and we have to adapt our behavior. Knowledge learning goes down tremendously after people finish education. And certainly if you're not in research or academia or whatever, new knowledge is, you know, you pick up as you go along, but behavioral learning requires things to become open to you and for you then to consider they're important. And you only do that by actually generating new experiences or having new conversations and new insights. So they're definitely part of that. Also, I'd like just very briefly to say, what are some, you may be asking, so what are the practical things that I can take away to do as a leader or to address and so on? Many of those things you may be already doing. We pay lip service to personal development plans and things like that, but every leader should at least have one or two curiosities that they're pursuing, which are based on the context that they're in. So what is it asking of me now? And what should I be getting much better at? And do I have a proper plan to do that that works within my context? Secondly, the whole question of journaling. Some of the best leaders that I've come across do journal. They do reflect in one way and they capture those thoughts. The number of people say to me, it came to me in the middle of the night and now I've forgotten it. But that kind of practice of actually, particularly when you have a critical incident, what happened and so on, engaging with trusted confidence and developing people who are not yes people around you, pretty key. And another aspect which is absolutely key is actually taking the time to restore and renew your energies. And there's a lot that's been written about this. Do you know what really energizes you and what takes your energy away and what drives you over the edge? That sense of self-awareness is really important as contexts test you and test your mettle.
Fantastic, Anthony. I want to really thank you for your time and your, I mean, wonderful insight. I mean, thoroughly enjoyed it. Even though I'm watching everything else, I'm really locked into the topic. Clearly, we've hit a nerve with regards to the number of people that have shown up to listen in. And just as we close off, just want to mention that the recording will be coming out to you. Please feel free to share that into your communities. And where you like, and of course, if you want to reach out to Anthony, you've seen his details there, and I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you at any moment. So, with an awareness around the time, I'm going to close that off for us, Anthony. But I want to thank you again.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate that. All the very best.
Thank you, everyone, and good night, and we'll see you hopefully next month on the 4th for our next webinar. Thank you.